Good evening, everyone. My name is Bahhaj Taherzadeh. I'm very happy to be able to welcome you tonight on behalf of the U.S. Baha'i Publishing Trust in collaboration with the Wilmette Institute for tonight's talk. Tonight's speaker, Michael Day, I'm sure is known to many of you already. Michael, in recent years, has really emerged as one of the leading lights among Baha'i authors and Baha'i historians. He's published a number of books. A series of 3 books about the Shrine of the Bab were published by George Ronald, and Michael recently wrote and published a book with us, with the U.S. Baha'i Publishing Trust, which is called Point of Adoration. And it tells the story, or at least perhaps the first chapter of the story of the establishment of the Shrine of Baha'u'lláh. And this really is a book that I can recommend very highly. It's a beautifully written and very thoroughly researched book, and I think readers will find quite a bit in it that is new to them. So I don't want to ramble on any further, really. I'll hand things over to Michael. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of Michael's presentation. There'll be a Q&A. So if you want to ask a question, please put it, you'll see a Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. Don't put it in the regular chat box. It might get lost in there. Please use the Q&A box for any questions. And I will turn things over to Michael.
Well, thank you, Bahhaj, and thank you to the Wilmette Institute and the US Baha'i Publishing Trust for this opportunity to talk about the book Point of Adoration. It's a privilege also to be on the same seminar day as my former colleagues, Kathy Hoganson and Gary Hoganson and their colleague Joel. I'm reading their book, and it's I can really recommend it. It's excellent, and I'm looking forward to Gishu's Mahaj's book when it becomes available here. Now, the subject of Point of Adoration, which is the term used for the Shrine of Baha'u'lláh, one of the terms used for the Shrine of Baha'u'lláh, the aim of the book is to tell the story of the establishment of the Shrine of Baha'u'lláh, and to do that, it's necessary to obviously put it into context of the things that were happening in the nearby the Shrine of Baha'u'lláh in the last decade of Baha'u'llah's life. But first of all, I think a scene setter would be appropriate. I wanted to just describe it to you as I've written in the book in modern times, just so that we get in the mood for it, because this is a very sacred subject to all of us. We all have those who have been to the shrine and those who know about it will feel a certain strong affection for it, and I think it's good to center our minds on it. So that's why in the first chapter of the book, I write about a dawn or an evening observance at the shrine, just to put the readers in the mood of the sacred subject to which we are about to approach. So if we could have the photo of the evening view, it's a beautiful modern photo of the Bahjí, which is the compound in which the shrine is located, and you can see the shrine in the top 3/4 of the image. It's all illuminated there, and you can see the mansion's lights, the story of the mansion behind it. But I will just start reading this abbreviated version of the scene setter, and those of you who wish can continue to look at the photo, or those who want to picture it in your mind, how you remember it, then please do so. You can close your eyes and think about it. Okay, here we go. It is the early hours of the morning, ahead of the commemoration at 3 a.m. of the ascension of Baha'u'lláh, which occurred on 29 May 1892. The dark shapes of trees line the pathway like silent spiritual sentinels. The pilgrims adopt appropriate postures of reverence as they move along. Underfoot, the shuffling pebbles seem to click a rhythmic welcome. The night insects sound their anthems. Eventually, the illuminated mansion of Bahí appears in all its grandeur, reminding mere mortals that a manifestation of God once inhabited these holy precincts. The Columns Gate, the entry to the holy precincts, is open, encouraging attentive ones to notice the fine filigree features of the arch towering above. In an instant, eyes swivel to the dignified yet humble shrine ahead and to their right. This is the sacred spot to which their hearts, minds, and souls have turned every day in their far-off countries as they recited their daily obligatory prayers. There is a collective intake of breath and an occasional tear. To the immediate left of the shrine, a glass clerestory under a high tiled roof signals the presence of a large, well-lit room below the outer shrine. A tent-shaped portico, the entrance moves into focus. The familiar calligraphic symbol of the greatest name above it is centered in a golden star, but its 19 points are too far away to count. In the book, I continue with describing the experience of entering the shrine, but I'll leave that to you. And all of our experiences are ours personally, and I don't like to, put up expectations that people will have certain experiences that I've had or others have had, but I think it is instructive to record some of them. And I just wanted to tell you about a couple of times when I've escorted, as part of my duties at the Baha'i World Centre, people who weren't members of the Baha'i faith who came into the shrine. And one of them was a journalist who told me he was an atheist, but nevertheless he wanted to go into the shrine. So there was just the two of us, and I told him what I was going to do, and that is, as you know, we walk slowly up to the threshold and bow our heads onto the threshold there and say our prayers, and then when we're finished, we retreat backwards, walking carefully backwards, back to the rear of the shrine usually. So I told him that's what I would do. And so we both walked in, and I did what I said I would do. And then he was still standing at the back of the shrine, and I went out of the shrine, and I expected him to follow me quite quickly, given that his atheistic beliefs had been clearly proclaimed by him. But he stayed there. He stayed not 5 minutes, not 10 minutes. I was looking at my watch, not quarter of an hour, not 3/4 of an hour, but an hour. He was staying in the shrine. When he came out, I wondered what he was going to say to me, but he didn't say anything. He just looked ahead, and we walked in silence back to the pilgrim house. I think it's hard to know. I think it seemed that he was overwhelmed by the experience. And another time I took a Christian minister, a woman, into the shrine, and she walked up to the threshold. And then when we came out, she said to us who were with her, when I was at that place at the threshold there, I heard the voices of a Christian hymn. I thought, oh, that's incredible. That's amazing. And she recited the words of the Christian hymn, which I think was something like the glory of God. But of course, many people will have their own experience. Some it will be a reminder of the revelation of Baha'u'lláh with no special mystical experiences. Some will have mystical experiences, and others their own. But I wanted to, when I'm describing this book, I don't mean to tell you the story, but the story unfolds, and the facts of the story or the account, the historical facts, lead up to the climax of the book, which is at the end of the book, the inauguration of the shrine. But I wanted to talk about how I think is the best way to approach and that is to try and see how Baha'u'lláh himself may have viewed events affecting him, events in the world, events that are described in the book. What was Baha'u'llah's perspective of it? we know that as a manifestation of God, as Baha'is, we see him as reflective of the spiritual attributes of the divine. Among those were the Almighty, the All-Powerful. And I think rather than to see events being acted upon him, to see him as acting upon events, rather than a leaf being blown around in the winds of the events, that he arranged things. And once I started looking at it that way, it was quite incredible to me. The other point I would like to say is that when his eldest son, Abdul-Baha, comes into the story very early and right through the book, we know of him as the exemplar, as the pattern in which we base our lives. And I think what I understand is that every aspect of his life, he's not a part-time exemplar, he's a full-time exemplar. Everything is an example to us. So when we read what he did and what happened to him, I think it's good to think about why did he do it this way and what was the reason for it. This way, I think we all look at the events that are described in the book through our own individual minds, the independent investigation of truth, the personal understanding that we develop as one of the crucial aspects of the Baha'i teachings that Abdul-Baha would emphasize over and over again, that we make our own interpretation of it within the, of course, the guidelines of Baha'u'lláh himself and of Abdul-Baha, Shoghi Effendi and the Universal House of Justice. But there is so much scope for us to come to the conclusions that come to our minds as we move through the book. Now, the book starts with a prologue describing Baha'u'lláh, but rather than do that myself, because we are talking about a manifestation of God, I draw on the descriptions that the Universal House of Justice included in a publication called Baha'u'lláh that was published in 1892. And among those descriptions, when they call on the scripture, it says, those luminous gems of holiness appear out of the realm of the spirit in the noble form of the human temple and made manifest unto all men, that they may impart unto the world the mysteries of the unchangeable being and tell of the subtleties of his imperishable essence. The interesting thing that I found while researching and writing this book is that my mind could never encompass the whole personality of Baha'u'lláh, and I was comforted in this by the words of the great Baha'i author, Mazra Gale, who she said, most books bring you closer to the author, but when you study the work of Baha'u'lláh, he eludes you. And then Shoghi Effendi said that the exact and thorough comprehension of Baha'u'llah's stupendous revelation was beyond the reach and ken of our finite minds, that Baha'u'lláh is transcendental in his majesty, serene, awe-inspiring, unapproachably glorious. And that came to me while researching it. And I think that for all of us, this story of the last decade of his life will have hopefully will have that effect on most of us. So after the prologue introducing Baha'u'lláh to the readers, I then include a description of the modern day shrine. So just to focus it like I did before for you in the introduction. Now we can move on from that photograph and we'll back to the book. The second chapter of the book is when the narrative starts. So the narrative is part of a 4-part series in the book. The book starts with part 1 is the road to Bahji. Part 2 is the guests of Baha'u'lláh at Bahji. Part 3 is the holy writings, and part 4, the climax of the book, the establishment of the shrine. So when we get to the first part of the book, it starts off with the attaining the sacred threshold, which I described to you earlier. But then we come to the scripture of supreme importance to the shrine, and this is the time in 1873, and this is why the book starts at that point. 1873 is when Baha'u'lláh revealed the Katabi Akdas. Katabi Akdas is his most holy book, the Book of Laws, and this is when he referred to his forthcoming ascension and to his resting place. And as we know, the resting place that he mentioned in that book was to be the Qiblih, the point to which we turn in adoration and prayer when we say our obligatory prayers. This is, and he refers to his own passing, and that I'll leave it to you, though. I'm not going to spoil the book by telling you aspects ahead of time, because the book is designed so that these come upon us gradually and sometimes surprisingly, sometimes new information, sometimes confirming things that you already know. But the structure of it is such that it's not a mere list of events, it's the context in which they happen. But just one part of that aspect of the revelation of the Katabi Akdas, in which his resting place is mentioned for the first time, is that it was proclaimed, it was revealed in a very humble room at the back of the building that we know now as the House of Abud. And many of the pilgrims, well, all of the pilgrims who have been there will recognize my description of it, I'm sure, as a humble room, which is now decorated, I mean, furnished in the manner that it was when Bahá lived in it. But in the earlier times, it was even more simple, and it overlooked a busy square down below. So why would the greatest book in the revelation of Baha'u'lláh, and probably what Baha'is would call the greatest book in the history of humanity, why would this occur in such a humble setting? So everything was, and from what I came to believe, it was intentional. Baha'u'lláh could have revealed it somewhere else, somewhere maybe in the countryside or in a mansion, but it was in this room among society. Out the window, he could hear the voices of people and children playing in the yard. The society of the city in full bloom. We don't know. There's nothing written as to why he did it that way, but we can think about it, that this book of laws was to guide society, our living lives for the future to come. After I talk about the revelation of that scripture, I move on to a chapter called Guidelines for the Shrine. And this is talking about, first of all, with reference to the Qiblih, there was no prescription in the Katabi Akdas of the geographical location of the Qiblih, but we do know that it was from the location of the Qiblih was, we know that from the writings of the Bab, that it was to be where the resting place of the manifestation, and Baha'u'lláh himself confirmed that. Now, there are other aspects of the Qiblih that you'll read about, and then we come along to places of pilgrimage, and you might be surprised. Those of you who know already won't be surprised, but you might be surprised that in the Katabi Akdas, the shrine is not mentioned as a place of pilgrimage. But it is now definitely a place of pilgrimage, and I tell you in the book. I explain in the book exactly how that happened, but there are other places that are points of pilgrimage, and I describe them, and I describe the rites. And of course, rather than keep you in suspense, of course, they are the house of the Bab and the house of Baha'u'lláh, the house of Bab in Shiraz, and the house of Baha'u'lláh in Baghdad. Now, there are rites. Baha'u'lláh revealed these places of pilgrimage when he was in Adrianople in the 1860s, and there are I list the rites that, when I mean rites, I mean the procedures that we adopt when we go into the shrine, into those places of pilgrimage. As those who have been to the shrine of Baha'u'lláh know, there is no specific rule as to how to comport oneself within the shrine, but we have been taught by the example of the exemplar, Abdul Baha, Shoghi Effendi, those who have been closely involved with the shrine, that the normal procedure is to enter reverently, to walk up slowly to, as I mentioned before, up to the corridor, up to the threshold, where we lay our head down on the threshold, and it's up to us what we do. But I think the practice is generally to say prayers or supplicate, and then when we retreat, we retreat backwards. Now, this is not a rule of the faith. It's following the example of the exemplar. Right, we move on to the next chapter, and we come to 2 special weeks. These are the weeks in March in 1873. Now, why are they special? Well, for one reason, Baha'u'lláh revealed a special tablet called the Tablet of the Vision, which Abdul-Bahá advises us. And when Abdul-Bahá advises us, I think we should take his advice. He says to reflect upon these most exalted words and comprehend the purpose of this hidden and sacred mystery. Through this tablet, the Tablet of the Vision, I believe you can be shown the lights of heaven. So once you read that part of the book, I think you'll be wanting to read that tablet. The other event that happened in that week, in those 2 weeks, was the wedding of the master. So Abdul-Bahá married Muniri Khanum in the house of Abud in March in 1873. Why is that included in the book about the Shrine of Baha'u'lláh? For many reasons, but one of them is that the marriage of Baha'u'lláh, the marriage of Abdul-Bahá was it produced 4 daughters, and one of the daughters gave birth to Shoghi Effendi, who was very closely involved with the Shrine of Baha'u'lláh and the rehabilitation of the Mansion of Bahar. So it is a very crucial event in the history of the faith that Abdul-Bahá got married. And I include quite a few details of the wedding ceremony, which I think is interesting, always taking into mind that I'm looking at these chapters as an exemplar. Why did Abdul-Bahá do certain things? For instance, why was it such a simple ceremony? There are only a few family members and a few guests, and it didn't take very long. Why is it a simple ceremony? What is the lesson for us in terms of weddings? The other lesson that and that's for us to contemplate. I want to make clear that this book isn't an official history or an official commentary on the topic. It's interpretation of somebody who assembled the facts as accurately as possible and tried to write them in a story that brought out the true significance, hopefully what actually happened, and then for the readers to, as I said before, to make their own interpretation. How did Baha'u'lláh see these events? How did Abdul-Bahá see them, and what example does he set? The other thing is, somebody has mentioned that Abdul-Bahá came quite late on in the gathering of his wedding, and people say, oh, he was late for his wedding. But if you look at it in terms of what actually happened when he wasn't there, you may come to a conclusion that I did, that this was the time that Baha'u'lláh was addressing Muniri Khanum about who she was marrying, about the significance of the event. So having Abdul-Bahá there would have interrupted that process. This is my feeling. There's no authority to say that, but I'm started to look at things, everything from the example of the master. Speaking of which, I think in the terms of what Abdul-Bahá looked like, we tend to sort of think of Abdul-Bahá in the photographs that we have of him now in our houses, in our meetings, meeting rooms, and in our Baha'i centers, as a elderly gentleman with a long white beard, quite an impressive looking man with his hair and a turban. That's a photograph taken when he was in his 60s, but at this time he was only about 28. So he was known, and we know this from descriptions, he was a very handsome young man, taller than the average Persian. His eyes seemed to range from grey blue to change in color to a certain extent, but he was very strongly built. He was slim, very strongly built. He was a swimmer. He could swim from Akká to Haifa. He was a horseman. He was very fit and strong. He was regarded as extremely handsome, and of course his personality was something else. I think it's really interesting because Maneri Khanum, thank goodness for her. By the way, her name was changed, as you know, to Maneri, which means luminous, but we could probably see that as radiant. Baha'u'lláh saw her as radiant because he renamed her. When his wife Maneri Khanum later spoke of Abdul Baha, I think she came with a fantastic description. She said to the people talking about him, "You have known him in recent years, but then in the youth of his beauty and manly vigor, with his unfailing love, his kindness, his cheerfulness, his sense of humor, his untiring consideration for everybody, he was marvelous, without equal, surely, in all the earth." I think this is an incredible description by a bride of her husband, of Abdul Baha. So if we think of him as probably the most significant, apart from the manifestation of that, he was the most significant person in the city. He could answer the questions of those who came to him with queries about spirituality or even about practical affairs. Those in the mosque assigned to him a special room where he could meditate and pray, and where they came for advice on all sorts of matters, including of religion. He was very well versed in all the Holy Quran and the Bible and other religions, and he could answer the questions for them. Okay, so we've moved on from the wedding. We've now come to the world of the soul. Now, just after the wedding, Baha'u'lláh remained in the house of Abu there for another 4 years. So there are some touching scenes when he would come out onto the balcony of that building. What would happen would be the men and the Baha'is who are working and living in Akká would come and stand below the balcony near the seawall there and look up, hoping for the chance of seeing Baha'u'lláh. And sometimes he would call them up to his room, and they would have these amazing experiences. And when they came down from that room, they would try and relate them to those who'd come to see him. And so often they were stunned and they couldn't talk. Baha'u'lláh had this majestic appearance, let alone his majestic influence on people. Some people couldn't even look at his face. And those who did found it too was radiant. But then, of course, it came the time one time when Baha'u'lláh said that he had been in the city for too long. He wanted to see the country. The city was the world of bodies. He said the country, the world of the soul. So Abdul Baha tested it and went out to Bahjí, and it was a beautiful time of year when he went out there with the spring blossoms on the fruit trees and the flowers. Everybody who's been to the Holy Land at that time will know how beautiful it is. And that's when he first saw the Mansion of Bahar. So he found that he could go out of the prison city without being hassled by the guards. So he went back and he said, and he arranged for the rental of a property that we now know as Mazra. And he came back and he asked Baha'u'lláh to would he accompany him out to Mazra and move his residence from Akká to this beautiful country mansion. As you know, a lot of you would know that Baha'u'lláh was reluctant to do so, and he put up. No one was loved more by Baha'u'lláh than Abdul Baha, and no one loved Baha'u'lláh more than Abdul Baha. So Abdul Baha was a very articulate person. You'd think if anybody could persuade Baha'u'lláh on some course of action, it would be Abdul Baha. But Baha'u'lláh did not take the persuasion of Abdul Baha. Now, there's a reason for it. There's a reason in everything that Baha'u'lláh did. There's a reason for everything that Abdul Baha did. And I have pondered about this. It was up to you to look at what happened. What happened was another person, a sheikh, a Muslim sheikh, an Arab, was the one who approached and managed to persuade Baha'u'lláh that it was safe, or that it was a time for him to go into the countryside. And Baha'u'lláh did, he went by carriage to Mazra, and I think there was something in his journey from Akká to the mansion that's really worth you reading in the book. I won't spoil it for you now, but what happened on that journey is something incredible in terms of the attitude that the master had, that Abdu'l-Bahá had to the manifestation of God. I describe what happened at the mansion, and also his visits to a garden called the Garden of Rizwan, named after the garden in Baghdad, which Abdu'l-Bahá had established not so far away, and what Baha'u'lláh did there. I'll leave that for you to read. So we're moving on now to the time that Baha'u'lláh, after 2 years there, went to Bahjí. He'd come back into Akká, and then Abdu'l-Bahá told him about the mansion that he had rented for him. And Baha'u'lláh left in the evening to go to the mansion of Bahjí, and that's where he established himself in the southeast room. Those who've been on pilgrimage will have been into Baha'u'llah's room. It was above the front door, but to the left of the mansion in the southeast corner. One of the reasons that building became, or the main reason the building became available to him, was that one of his landlord at the House of Abud had purchased the building, had renovated it, and he used to use it as a summer residence. And there were buildings around it that the family had built, including a 2-storied building that was just the back of the house, which is what we sort of view it as the front of the house, but it's actually the back of the house once we approach from the visitor center. There's a big 2-story building there, and the family used to stay there, and they stayed there for their summer break. But then a plague, which seems to have been the bubonic plague, affected the area, and the owner of that, Udi Kamar, perished, and he is blessed to be buried within the confines of the areas of the Mansion of Bahjí. And we can now look at the black and white photograph of the Bahjí as it appeared in later years, but it was fairly similar to what it was like when Baha'u'lláh first entered there. And you can see the mansion and the front door of the mansion. That's that big door with a stone arch over it. And then to the right there, you see that little door just about 3/4 away along. You can see a little door there. That's the door into the room where Udi Kamar is buried, just below the room of Baha'u'lláh. Baha'u'lláh is on the right-hand side of the front of the mansion there. Now, in that room, that's where the grave of Udi Kamar, and I was fortunate enough to be permitted to go and have a look at that grave. So I went in there, and I have written the epitaph on top of that, which is on top of it's a grave of about 1.5 meters tall. There is an epitaph in Arabic, and I've written a translation of the epitaph, which is quite fitting for you to read in the book on top of that grave. Now you can see the buildings along the side, and see the 2-story building at the back there. Right at the back, you can just see the roof, and I think an archway. That's a big 2-story building, and that Shoghi Effendi in later years arranged to be demolished. There are also buildings to our left of that, looking from our point of view, to the left of the mansion. These were houses that the family and others lived in, who had rented it. But then when Baha'u'lláh moved into the mansion, so did members of his extended family. Abdu'l-Bahá and Muniri, though, didn't. They stayed with their children. They stayed in Akká, and so did Asiyah Khanum, Baha'u'llah's first wife, and the greatest holy leaf. They stayed living in Akká. Okay, so that's the mansion. Now, I wanted to describe it so that when we go now to Bahjí, it seems all quiet and beautiful, and it was quite different in those days. It was a lot of people there, and I list a number of people. I list the people certainly to have been there, and a list of those, the main ones in the book, but also in the notes to the book. There's about 50 people who I can name who lived there either all the time or part of the time. And so it was a very busy compound, and I described the compound from notes and various indications and various cultural things about the lively scenes that were happening when Baha'u'lláh was in the spent most of his time in his room where he was revealing scriptures, although he did venture out. He'd often go to Akká in the winter time. The Mansion of Bahar could be cold in the winter, so he would go into a warmer environment into Akká where Asir Khanum and the family were, visit his grandchildren. He would also go to the the homes of his brothers and things like that. He'd also go on picnics in the summer. He'd go to places that those of you who have been to that area would know, the Janain Gardens. I described those picnics, and I'll leave that for you to enjoy the descriptions. And he also went to, of course, the mansion of, to the Garden of Rizwan. Now, when we to explain how Baha'u'lláh thought about Abdul-Baha, there is a reference to his quotation when one day Abdul-Baha went to Beirut and left the Holy Land, and I've included that quotation as well in the book. You may be familiar with it, but it shows the incredible bond between the two. Right, so I move on to who were the guests that Baha'u'lláh, the guests of Baha'u'lláh. We're now on to part two. Now we can move on from that photograph just so that we can concentrate more on who. So I divided them all up into the guests. So with 3 poets, that's chapter 9, 3 poets. So the 3 poets I focus on who were in the presence of Baha'u'lláh were Nabil, often called the poet laureate of the Baha'i faith, a very gifted poet with an eloquent tongue who, of course, wrote the Dawnbreakers. He was often in his presence, and it's said that Baha'u'lláh showed him the lights of paradise, I think a glimpse into the next world. Another poet that I described, I'm just giving you a summary here, but another one was Andalib. Andalib was a great poet who was, his poems showed the greatness of Baha'u'lláh and how much Baha'u'lláh was loved. And Andalib is interesting for the fact that many Baha'is, Persian Baha'is, when they were children, were rocked to sleep to the sound of a poem that he recited, a bit like for the English descended people here, Rockabye Baby on the Treetop. But the poem that Andalib wrote had a spiritual content to it, and it's very familiar to many Persians. You might be interested to know that Andalib taught Edward Granville Brown, the English professor who was in Persia prior to coming to the Holy Land. Another poet who was in the presence of Baha'u'lláh was Salmani, who was also his barber. He once asked Baha'u'lláh, Baha'u'lláh just asked him, what would you like to be? And he said, a poet like Saadi, a famous Persian poet. And he was this uneducated, quite sort of rough and ready kind of a guy, suddenly was possessed of a lyrical gift, and his poems are full of passion and emotional immediacy. The aspect about this that I find interesting is that Baha'u'lláh, just like the Universal House of Justice today and our national assemblies, are encouragers of the arts. Baha'u'lláh loved having the poets around him. He would encourage those with poetic abilities to produce poems. He would encourage Mishkin Kalam, the great calligrapher, with his calligraphy. So Baha'u'llah's example followed later by Abdul-Baha, or at the same time as well, the encouragement of the arts. Right, so we move on to chapter 10, A Curious Visitor, and you probably know that I'm going to refer there to Edward Granville Brown, who was an English professor from Cambridge University. He was an academic, he was an Orientalist, he was also a medical doctor. He became very interested in the Baha'i faith, or the Baha'i faith, after reading a book about him in the university library. He went to Persia, and I recommend all Persians to read his wonderful book called A Year Among the Persians. not only Persians read it, but all Baha'is to read it, because this is a very, very well written book of the Persia of those years. He was fluent in Persian, fluent in Turkish, fluent in Arabic. He had a memory that would record, he could record conversations word for word. It was remarked upon by his colleagues at the university, this guy's got a photographic memory. He could remember conversations and write them down. Anyway, we know this because he was told about the Baha'i faith by various prominent Baha'is in Persia, and he wrote down what they told him. And when you read it today in that book, you'll see that's how we teach the faith today. So it's obviously accurate. Now I write in the next chapter about how he came to Bahjí and the manifestation giving him an audience. Now we can look at it that Edward Granville Brown wanted to come to Akká to meet Baha'u'lláh. I sort of see it more in terms of Baha'u'lláh wanting him to come, like calling him into his presence. If you look at it from a strategic point of view, which you can if you want to, which I do, Baha'u'lláh, when Baha'u'lláh was on this earth, there were about 15 countries that were open to the faith. But the vast majority of the countries, well, a quarter of mankind was controlled by the British Empire. And of course, there was North America as well. Who better to proclaim the faith to those countries, the English-speaking world, than an academic from one of the most prestigious universities in the world who would record accurately what Baha'u'lláh told him, who was fluent in Persian and Arabic, and who wanted to publish about the Baha'i faith. Now, it took me a long time to come to grips with Edward Granville Brown, so you think he'd be a Baha'i, but he was, I spoke to an Oxford scholar about it, and it was quite clear that, in fact, he was a nominal Christian, but religion wasn't the thing that he was so much interested in. It was more the academic side and the constitutional side of Persia, but things changed in later life, which I'll get into in subsequent volumes. It was a fascinating character, and Baha'u'lláh and Abdul-Baha gave him the great privilege of him being in their presence. Later on, his words were used in the first public proclamation of the faith in the United Kingdom and in the USA. So there's two chapters involving that person. They move on to another chapter specifically on we call him the Apostle of the Crimson Ark. Well, that was I'll just try and get that right. Taherzadeh Samandari, who was later appointed to the high rank in the Baha'i faith of Hand of the Cause. This person would have been known to many people in his later years. He was a dynamic speaker, and he spoke at many conferences in the United States and I think the UK and Persia. He was often in the presence of Baha'u'lláh, thank goodness, because he wrote down what happened, what his experiences were. But I describe him, and I describe a special mission that Baha'u'lláh gave to Mr. Samandari, and I'll leave that for you to discover what that mission was. Right, then we move on to the appointment of the Hands of the Cause in the chapter I call Light and Glory. Right, my alarm's just gone off with it. We'll have about another 10 minutes, but a presentation before questions. So the next chapter is Light and Glory, Appointment of the Hands of the Cause. The Hands of the Cause were really, let's just say, the accomplished teachers of the faith, and Baha'u'lláh recognized the potential in these people. He named them, it was referred to in the Katabi Akká, and Baha'u'lláh named 4 of them, and I go into the biographic details of these 4. The interesting thing about them, I think, is that they were encouraged by Baha'u'lláh to practice the art of consultation. Consultation is a consensus decision-making technique that Baha'is use so that we can come to decisions where all ideas and thoughts that come to those involved are put into the circle, which we then sort of consider objectively rather than from who said them or so we approach things in a very objective way. Well, these Hands of the Cause were practicing consultation with the encouragement of Baha'u'lláh, and I should mention that people would come to Baha'u'lláh with questions and ask him for the answers, and he would say, no, go and sometimes he would answer them, of course, but sometimes he'd say, no, you've got to go and consult her on it. So he was Baha'u'lláh was encouraging the consensus decision-making process of the consultation during his lifetime on earth and in his writings. Okay, so now we move to part 3, holy writings. The first one is encountering revelation. I described the various accounts that people who were privileged to enter the presence of Baha'u'lláh had while Baha'u'lláh was revealing scripture. Now, you may know that when Baha'u'lláh was revealing scripture, he described it more as like the words would appear before him. I sort of picture it, and I don't know whether that's right, a bit like a screen in front of him. But anyway, he saw these words and he would dictate them to a secretary who would write them down and then transcribe them in later moments, and assisted by Baha'u'lláh if the secretary couldn't recognize one of the things that he'd written down. It's very interesting to see the various physical reactions as well as the mental and spiritual reactions of various people, and that's in that chapter called Encountering Revelation. Just for a little introduction to it, let's have a look at what Hajjah Ali, the Mirza Hajjah Ali, who was known as the Angel of Carmel, when he was in the presence of Baha'u'lláh, he wrote about his experience. And here it is. As I entered his room, I heard streams of words sweeping along in a torrential flow from his lips. It seemed that the atmosphere, the floor, the walls, and every atom in the room was filled with perfume. Isn't that interesting that the sense of smell, the sense of perfume, as well as the sound of the words were dominating the whole atmosphere of the room that Hajjah Ali is. But there are some others that are fascinating. Baha'u'lláh was very industrious, I suppose, is a word I could use for in the last years of his life. He reduced tablet after tablet, and Abdul-Baha says about these tablets, we hear that the tablets of Ishrakat, which is these are the names of the tablets, Tarazat, Bisharat, Tajali, excuse my pronunciation, Tajaliyat, and Kalimat, we hear that these tablets have been translated and published in those regions. Here's the key. In these tablets, will ye have a model of how to be and how to live? These tablets have been compiled by the Universal House of Justice into a volume, and obviously these tablets are very important for us to read. And may I suggest, after my own experiences, that reading tablets slowly and carefully is the way to go to contemplate and ponder what is being said. And you'll come, in one of the tablets, you'll come to the a litany of direct advice on the way that a Baha'i should live. And I'm sure that you'll like that, find that chapter very interesting. We move on to chapter 16, which is the Tablet of Carmel. And as you know, that was the tablet that was the spiritual foundation of the Baha'i World Center and the Shrine of the Bab, and does indicate the towering importance of a shrine of a manifestation, which is something that we're talking about today. We then move on to an extraordinary epistle, the Epistle of the Son of the Wolf, which Shoghi Effendi said that it's a library, and it's a book that Baha'u'lláh enjoyed composing. And if you read it slowly, just a few pages at a time, and then read some the next day, that's how I do it anyway, but everybody to their own. But I find that that's a good way of absorbing all the different passages in that wonderful book. So now we come to part 4, the climax of the book, the establishment of the shrine. Now, the sudden sickness of Baha'u'lláh came at a time when Abdul-Baha and Bahia Khanum were in Akká. They found out about it by a servant arriving with 2 horses, and they both got on the horses and galloped to the mansion of Bahji. Now, it's maybe surprising that for some of you that Bahia Khanum, the greatest holy leaf, was a competent horsewoman, but for people of her social class, riding horses was something that was done. And Abdul-Baha, of course, was a master horseman, and they both, brother and sister, rode together and found that Baha'u'llah's health was in peril. I described the various days, and drawing on the works of researchers such as David Merrick and very excellent research, and other writers, we find the progress of Baha'u'llah's health. His health waxed and waned in that month. You know, it seemed to get better, then it got worse. I also described the doctors, including a Baha'i doctor who was there, and what the experience of that doctor administering to Baha'u'lláh. Then we move to chapter 19, the supreme affliction, the ascension of the manifestation, when he passed away in the early hours of the 29th of May, 1892. And on that, I rely on Shoghi Effendi's description, which no doubt was informed by listening to Abdul Baha talk about it. The establishment of the Shrine of Baha'u'lláh. Well, this is a chapter in which I describe the washing of the body of Baha'u'lláh, and the clothing, the shrouds, the shrouding we call it, and the what happened in the funeral of Abdul Baha'u'lláh, which is not much is known, not much has been consolidated into a story, but using the various clues, the various references to it and the points, various times of the year and times of the day, I've managed to describe a provisional description of the funeral of Baha'u'lláh, which, of course, you know, because Abdul Baha, who was deeply grieving at this effect, he arranged, I described what happened, how the coffin was carried with all due solemnity into the building just over the lawn from the Shrine of Baha'u'lláh through the southern gate in the wall that you'll all be familiar with, which we believe that is the door that the coffin would have come out of and moved across to the room that was assigned for it. I described what that room was. What was it before it became the Shrine of Valhalla, and you'll be interested, I'm sure, in the description of that room. Now, we know from various evidences what happened, what time it was. It was just after sunset, so it was darkening, or probably even a little bit later. It was quite dark. So, you know, the lamps that were used, the particular kinds of procession of the cortege that Baha'u'lláh was to use in later years. And so we can assume that something similar to that occurred at that time. What happened within the shrine? Now, you know that the tablet of visitation, the prayer that we now say in the shrine, that wasn't available at the time. So it is likely, apart from the prayer for the dead that Baha'u'lláh revealed, the tablet that he revealed, the tablet of visitation for Imam Hussein, was recited at the funeral. But I described that, and I think that chapter is really important. Obviously, it's the climax of this book. It's about the inauguration of the Shrine of Baha'u'lláh. So I'll leave you to experience the descriptions yourself. We move on to the chapter 21, the days of mourning. I was very delighted to find that there were some copies of the tributes that were paid by many people from various religions who came for the mourning period, about a week of mourning period that happened at the Mansion of Bahar. And I have, those are translated from the Arabic into the English, a couple of them, to show you the respect, more than respect, the great honor and that people paid to the manifestation who had passed away. That chapter also describes the reaction of the Baha'is, the mourners, the women inside the mansion, the VIPs who came for the days of mourning. I think you'll really enjoy reading that chapter, Days of Mourning. We move on to the facets of the jewel. This is where Abdul Baha commissioned Nabil to gather together from the writings of Baha'u'lláh the tablet of visitation, which we now know. And I think with that, the beauty of that tablet confirms the ability of Nabil, who was able to find passages that are so supremely relevant to the shrine and how beautiful they are when placed together. We moved into the reading of the will and testament of Baha'u'lláh, known as the Katabi. Excuse my pronunciation again. this was when this was revealed, when it was read, I should say, was confirmed that what everybody really assumed, that Abdul-Baha would be the successor of Baha'u'lláh as head of the faith. It's extremely important in the Baha'i faith. It's probably one of the greatest gifts that Baha'u'lláh gave to us, was the center of the covenant, the very careful and definite description of the role and powers of the center of the covenant, who was Abdul-Baha. It's really important to read what Baha'u'lláh said about that, and what the master said later on in New York City. He said, for instance, in New York City, to ensure unity and agreement, Baha'u'lláh, he has entered into a covenant with all the people of the world, including the interpreter and explainer of his teachings, that's Abdul-Baha, so that no one may interpret or explain the religion of God according to his own view or opinion, and thus create a sect founded upon his individual understanding of the divine words. So while we perceive the spiritual teachings as our mind interprets them, we know that as Abdul-Baha described the teachings, we follow that interpretation. We now move on to the final chapter. I find this very interesting as we move on to the final chapter, which is a new ministry. Abdul-Baha sent a message out to the world, and in his deep grief, he sent a message out to the world. And I'll leave that again to you to read. Shoghi Effendi, though, also made a comment in his writings about the passing of Baha'u'lláh. It's very interesting that the dissolution of the tabernacle, wherein the soul of the manifestation of God had chosen temporarily to abide, signalized its release from the restrictions which an earthly life had of necessity imposed upon it. Its influence no longer circumscribed by any physical limitations, its radiance no longer beclouded by its human temple. That soul could henceforth energize the whole world to a degree approached at any stage in the course of existence on this planet. And so it was clear from Shoghi Effendi's reference that the power of Baha'u'lláh was echoing, what is the word, spread throughout the world in increasing power. And of course, this is one of the places of the Shrine of Baha'u'lláh, so where we can find in our minds approaching that radiance and that energy. And when we look at the world today and we see the amazing achievements of technology that enables somebody here in Australia talking to people in the United States, with somebody listening, I know, from Brazil, from people probably in Japan, to friends in Indonesia, throughout Europe. We can all communicate with each other in this global society that Baha'u'lláh said at the very in the very audience that he gave to Edward Granville Brown, that the earth is but one country. He didn't say the earth will be one country. He said the earth is but one country. If we look at the world now, we have to try and look at the world through his eyes, that it's one country, that we're all part of the same society. If we look at it in his eyes, then those boundaries we sort of self-create through geographical boundaries, through racial boundaries, through gender boundaries, or whatever, they're all they all have to be subsumed by the idea that we are part of one society. It's so obviously true now. Baha'u'lláh could see it then, but we can see it, and we can see it through the technology that we're using as we're listening now. Of course, there are the big issues of the world. We see now that only they can be solved through a united world society. The pandemic that we've just experienced, climate change that we're experiencing. There's so many other big, huge global issues of war and peace, of economics, that only can be solved through for global unity. And Baha'u'lláh said this in his earthly life. And I just find that when you go into the shrine and you ponder on the great teachings of Baha'u'lláh, that there is something special that can happen to you and will happen to you in the rest of your life. Now, there's time now for some questions, and I'll pass it over to Bahhaj for him to read the questions that have been submitted, and I'm happy to answer any that I can at the moment.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, I will try to get through whatever questions we can in the time that we have. Just wanted to mention also, I've put the link for anyone who doesn't have the book yet. I put the link in the general chat where it can be ordered. So someone has asked, what clues do we have about physical future developments for the shrine?
Right. Well, that's a good question, and it's one that we no doubt all of us are interested in. I'm so glad that somebody asked that. Of course, it will be. It's really more fitting for a subsequent volume about the history of the Shrine of Valhalla. But what I have read so far, and I haven't done my full research on it, when Shoghi Effendi was the head of the faith, he spoke with the hand of the course Ugo Giacoeri about the shrine, and Ugo Giacoeri came up with a design. You might want to read that in his wonderful book called Shoghi Effendi. But he describes his idea that how the shrine could be, and he had a circle with columns, a circle encompassing Bahjí and the shrine and columns. Anyway, he presented it to Shoghi Effendi, who didn't do anything with it or say that it was going to be that way at all. So that was just an interesting contribution by a well-deepened and well-loved Baha'i, Ugo Giacoeri. But we do know that it's going to be more magnificent than what we see now in the Shrine of the Bab. There's some reference to it that it would be the most magnificent development. But as to how it will be, or what will it look like, or when will it happen, all I know is that the Universal House of Justice is yet to start the research on that project of, looking into all these matters. But when it does, I'm sure that we will all hear about the plans for the future of the shrine, if that's done in our lifetime.
Okay, and someone asks, did General Gordon ever visit Baha'u'lláh at Bahjí?
General Gordon was a famous British general known for his presence in Khartoum and in the Sudan. Very famous. We do know that a European general came to the room of Baha'u'lláh, and that he knelt down, was offered hospitality, but didn't say anything. He was with another person. Now, that European general, we know that General Gordon came to the Holy Land, and there's nothing authoritative on it, but I think that people would probably assume that if a prominent European general was going to be taken to visit Valhalla, it's likely to have been General Gordon.
Okay, there's another very similar question about the future of the shrine, which I'll leave. Another one here asking on behalf of a group of friends studying Ruhi Book 8 on the Covenant, if we know the names of those present at the reading of the Katabi Act, and also if we know the names of those present at the interment of Baha'u'lláh into his tomb.
Right. Well, we do know some of the names of some of the people in the reading of the Katabi Act, and that's in the chapter. Called. I've read this book a million times, but I haven't memorized every chapter. Okay, so we after the days of mourning, I move on to the chapter called the Crimson Book, which was a sort of a title given to the book. And let's see, what do I say here? Okay, so the Katabi Act, which was a big group of Baha'u'llah's sons and some of the Bab's relatives, pilgrims, resident Baha'is. Mr. Samandri was there, we know that. The son of Mirza Kalim, his name was Majiddin, he was there. So the only Baha'is were there, and a few of them have been named. We could probably assume that some of those listed in the chapter about who was living at Bahjí, well, they would have, a good portion of those would have been there. What was the other? Was that was it? Oh, what else was it? The other question was the Katabi, and what was the other?
And those who would have been present
the,
for the interment.
Okay, so at the interment, well, of course, this is part of the description that I put in the shrine about who was there, but I suppose I'll leave that to you to read. I don't want to give a list of facts. I want things to come to you in the way that have been structured. Lists don't inspire. What inspires, I think, is the context in which things happen. And one of the techniques that writers adopt as a way to tell a story, hopefully, that will achieve the full inspiration and meaning of the events. But we don't. So I'll about who attended the funeral, I'll leave that to you to discover when you read the book.
Okay. Someone's asking about why Abdu'l-Baha and his family and Asiya Khanum were living in Akká rather than at Bahjí, and whether that could have been in part a sense of protection for Asiya Khanum.
Well, there's no definite reason given for why they stayed there, but there is a description of Abdu'l-Baha being. Well, Abdu'l-Baha was the spokesperson for Baha'u'lláh, if you want to say that, to the outer community. He would organize and arrange things and liaise with diplomats, with the city officials, with anybody who had any official business with the Baha'i community as such. And he was also, while he was in Akká, he used to, this is one of the things he did there. He used to help the pilgrims who'd arrived from Persia. So a lot of them had come from Persia or Iraq, and that was a very difficult journey in those days. You weren't wheeling your suitcase with wheels on it. You were struggling to get there sometimes. And so your clothes would be ripped and torn. And so he would make sure that their clothing, he would go to where they were staying and he would give them a new set of clothes. And tell the pilgrims what was going to happen when they went to see Baha'u'lláh. Baha'u'lláh was very punctual. He made appointments, and Abdu'l-Baha liked the pilgrims to be in there in good, clean, and respectable clothes when they encountered him. And I think you might be interested in knowing that in Akká there was the caravanserai where Abdu'l-Baha had a room, but he also lived, of course, at the house of Abud. But his the pilgrims were there. If you want to, you need to sort of throw your mind back to the time we're talking about. Let's just go to the mansion for a start. It wasn't blue and white and all quiet now as it is now. It was probably yellowish or greenish in color, and of course very busy with, as I describe it in the book, with Baha'u'lláh had a flock of goats and sheep, and he drank the goat's milk towards the end of his life. There's all sorts of things like that that are in the book, but I just described the caravanserai. This one is described by the famous British writer, Sir Richard Burton, not the actor, but the great explorer and the great linguist. He's talking about a caravanserai in Egypt, which is very similar. So it's a massive pile of buildings surrounding a courtyard, and those who've been to that caravanserai will know the one that I'm talking about. But so on the ground floor are rooms like cabins for merchandise. Excuse me. There were tailors, cobblers, bakers, tobacconists, fruiterers, and others. A roofless gallery or covered veranda into which all the apartments open runs around the first and sometimes the second story. The accommodation consists of two rooms, generally an inner and an outer one, and the outer one has a hearth, in other words, a fireplace for cooking, a bathing place, and similar things, presumably toilets. The staircases are high, narrow, and exceedingly dirty, dark at night, and often in bad repair. A goat or a donkey is tethered upon the different landings. Here and there, a fresh skin is stretched in process of tanning. and the smell reminds the veteran traveller of those old French inns. The interior is unfurnished. Even the pegs upon which clothes are hung have been pulled down for firewood. The walls are bare but for stains. Thick cobwebs depend in festoons from the blackened rafters of the ceiling, and the stone floor would disgrace a civilized prison. The windows are huge apertures covered with wood or iron. The travellers, the poorer sort of travellers, not so much, we're not talking about the pilgrims here, but the poorer sort of travellers consort with tethered beasts of burden down on the ground floor. Beggars howl and slaves lie basking and scratching themselves upon mountainous heaps of cotton bales and other merchandise. So that's what a caravanserai was like in Egypt, and it wouldn't be too different to the one that the pilgrims came to, where Abdu'l-Bahá would come there and visit them and prepare them for the mission of their journey, which is attaining the presence of Baha'u'lláh. So why they stayed there, I think, yes, it was for Abdu'l-Bahā's role as the spokesperson, the head, the acting CEO, you could almost call him, of the faith. But also, of course, it was a place where they had lived for some time, and people could make their own interpretations of the reasons. Of course, Baha'u'lláh often would go into Akká. He often would go and see Asiya Khanum, and he would meet his grandchildren. There were 4 girls, 2 of them were twins, and Baha'u'lláh loved his grandchildren. There's some great stories about how they loved him as well. He loved seeing them in their nice clothes, and he would give them sweets. And there's a great story somewhere about how Abdu'l-Bahá and his wife Maniri were putting the children to bed and sort of trying to keep them in order. And Baha'u'lláh, like a typical grandfather, was super generous and super, letting the kids sort of have their fun. And there is a story in one of the books about how much the kids loved him.
So several people are just sharing comments and saying how grateful they are for the book and how much they've enjoyed it. One person is asking if you're working on other books and if there's anything you can share.
I am. Of course, this book finishes at 1892, just after the funeral of Baha'u'lláh, where Abdu'l-Bahá assumes his role as centre of the covenant, head of the faith, and his responsibility for the Shrine of Baha'u'lláh. Because my book's about the Shrine of Baha'u'lláh, I focus on that. And immediately after the interment of the sacred remains of Baha'u'lláh, in the which I described in the what is now the inner shrine, Abdu'l-Bahá immediately strengthened, the walls had strengthened, directed the strengthening of the walls of the shrine with Palestinian stone, which you see now. It didn't look like it, as we see it now, it didn't look like that. It would be just like an extension of a room that's on those houses that I showed you earlier, but he made sure that the grave shrine was secure. And anyway, so he started a garden. So my story, my next one will be from, as I've already started, is from, and got partway through, is from 1892 to 1921, which is the period that Abdu'l-Bahá was the ministry of Abdu'l-Bahá. And yes, it's very interesting, very exciting, very amazing. Abdu'l-Bahá is always amazing, exciting, and interesting, but in terms of the shrine as well. So hopefully I'll have that ready for consideration for publication in about sometime next year. I'm also writing I've written a history of the Ark on Mount Carmel. I'm not sure when that's going to be published or if it's going to be published, but it's more or less finished. I hope to go on to if the opportunity and it's available, to write about the period when Shoghi Effendi was the head of the faith, and he did the magnificent refurbishment of the Mansion of Bahar. He removed some buildings. He did beautification around the shrine and the gardens as we know it today. So that's a very exciting period too.
And specifically concerning this book, someone's asking how long it took you to write it and when you started.
Probably started about 2019, and it probably took me at least probably 2 or 3 years to write, I think. Yeah, I mean, it was a very intense process, amazing process. I mean, you know, when you spend your life immersed in the history of the faith, the people become part of your life, and you develop an affection for them, like I do for Andalib, or I do for other people in the faith, and you become more and more amazed about Baha'u'lláh and see that he is the all-power, he is the manifestation of the all-powerful, the almighty. And when you look back on what happened, you see it as like a plan. I mean, it seems so well planned for the emergence of a world faith that he accomplished in his lifetime. Despite everything that was happening, his onward progression of the planning of the faith was something staggering. And that was the amazing experience. So, you know, you're sitting in your office and you're immersed in this, and then, you know, you come out into the world and see the global civilization that's increasingly coming to form and increasingly being understood, and seeing his words come to life. But so yeah, I probably looked into it a little bit before that, but mainly the main intense times were 2018, 2019, 2020, probably parts of 2021, and then it went to review. So reviewers had quite a few questions, and then reviewers more or less help people looking at it and helping to make sure that everything is answered or correct, or, you know, backed up with footnotes. I mean, nobody's making any I stand behind the book, nobody else needs to stand behind it, but you do get help from the publishers and from the reviewers, and trying to ensure that the sacred nature of the topic is duly observed in the text.
There's one very practical question, and that is, how far is the mansion of Bahjí from the house of Aboud?
It's about, I know the Baha'u'lláh, when Abdul Bahá was in America, he used to, not on the boat, ship to America, he used to pace along, and he paced a certain number of steps, and so that's how far it is. And the number of steps is given, and it's in my book, I think. Yeah, I think it's in my book, yeah. It's either in the text of the book or in the notes. By the way, the notes, please read the notes. Well, read the book first, but after you, and I suggest, by the way, when you read the book, please, I would suggest, I mean, what worked for me was to read the chapters one at a time and then think about it, you know, rather than move on and trying to accumulate all sorts of lists of facts. It's not so much the facts, it's the interpretation of the facts that is important for me anyway. And but those facts are interesting, aren't they? You know, how far away was it? Because, you know, sometimes they would walk, sometimes they would ride. Abdul Bahá would, I mean, it's quite staggering. Abdul Bahá, look at Abdul Bahá's name. What name did he choose for himself? A servant. I mean, and he would prostrate himself when he was going to meet Baha'u'lláh at the mansion. He would prostrate himself and then get up and walk. It's incredible, the respect that this giant of a human being, mysterious human being, the exemplar, has for the manifestation. He did this. He's our example of how to regard the manifestation. But anyway, he did mention the number of steps. There's about 1.5, 2 Ks maybe. But anyway, it's in the book somewhere in the notes. Anyway, I think I was going to say about the notes. After you read the book and concentrate on each chapter, read the notes, because there's quite a bit that didn't fit into the narrative, but it's lots of interesting bits of information that I've been hopefully given in a concise way in the notes. Yes, that's about 2 Ks.
I think we've covered really most of the questions people have asked, as far as I can see. I put the link again here in the chat for anyone looking for it, where you can order it directly from the Baha'i distribution service. Somebody did ask about an audiobook. I believe there are plans in motion for producing an audiobook. But I think we've answered the questions that have come in. So thank you so much, Michael, and thank you for everyone who's tuned in and enjoyed the presentation tonight.
Well, thank you, Bahhaj, for Bahhaj should be recognized as the editor of the book. He great help to me, and appreciate you fielding the questions, and thank you everybody for your interest in the book. And I hope that you are happy with the process of reading it and find inspiration. And if you haven't visited the shrine, then I hope you can make that as part of your plans for the future.
Yeah, I do recommend people read this book. I found personally, I've been working on Baha'i literature for so many years now, but and so many aspects of the history are familiar, but there was quite a lot of detail in this book that was totally new to me, and really, particularly around the time at Bahí and the passing of Baha'u'lláh, and the details you were able to gather about the funeral and the period of mourning. It's really quite striking to see it all gathered and laid out in one place and written so beautifully. So I strongly recommend it.